The house smelled of dust and old wood. Evelyn paused in the doorway, gripping the key tightly in her hand. The house, her house now, stood quiet and still, wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but occupied. She had inherited it from a distant relative, an aunt she had never met, a woman whose name she barely recognized when it appeared on the letter that changed her life. The house is yours now. The words felt heavy. The Victorian manor was old, too old, standing like a relic in a neighborhood that had long since outgrown it. The windows were tall and black as glass, the ornate iron fence rusted and twisted into strange curling shapes. A place untouched by time, a place waiting for someone to return. The attic's secret. The first few days were spent sorting through the past, boxes of old clothes, stacks of letters written in ink that had faded to near invisibility. Photographs of people she didn't recognize, their eyes dark and hollow, staring back at her from across decades. And then, on the third night, she found the mirror. It was hidden beneath a dust-covered sheet in the attic, leaning against the farthest wall. The air around it was thick, heavier than the rest of the house, as if the attic itself had been holding its breath. Evelyn hesitated before stepping forward. She pulled the sheet away, sending a wave of dust spiraling into the dim, flickering light of her flashlight. The mirror was enormous, its frame carved with delicate, swirling patterns that twisted into faces. Not decorative flourishes. Faces, each one frozen in an expression of fear. Evelyn's stomach tightened. Then, her own reflection blinked. She stiffened. That wasn't right. She raised a hand. The reflection followed. She turned her head. It mirrored her exactly. And yet, for a single unbearable second, she had seen someone else standing behind her. A shape, a shadow, gone the instant she turned around. Her breath came sharp, her pulse a dull, steady hammer against her ribs. It was just her imagination, just tricks of the light, just dust in her eyes. And yet, the mirror felt heavier now, like it had been waiting for her, like it had been watching. The mirror comes home. Evelyn brought the mirror down from the attic. She told herself it was because she had always wanted an antique mirror, that it belonged in the house. But deep down, in the part of her mind she refused to acknowledge, she knew the truth. The mirror wanted to be seen. She placed it in her bedroom, right across from her bed, where the first thing she would see in the morning and the last thing before she slept would be her own reflection. That night, the house creaked and settled. Wind whispered against the windows, the branches outside scraping against the glass like fingers. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something unseen. The air was wrong. Then, a soft noise, so faint she almost missed it. A breath, right by her ear. She turned her head sharply. The mirror was still. Her reflection lay in bed, just as she did, her face partially hidden in the darkness. Evelyn's heart slowed. It was just the house, just the wind. She turned back over, forcing her eyes closed. And behind her, in the mirror, her reflection was still watching. The first encounter. Evelyn didn't sleep. The air in the bedroom was thick, heavy with something unseen, something that pressed against her ribs like a held breath. Every time she drifted into unconsciousness, she felt it, the weight of eyes on her. And each time she turned, the mirror was there, still, watching. By morning, she had convinced herself it was nothing, just paranoia, just adjusting to the new house. She made coffee, stared at the mirror from across the room, and forced herself to breathe. But the feeling didn't leave. The reflection that stayed awake. That night, she did something different. She faced the mirror before going to bed. She studied herself, her dark hair hanging loosely around her shoulders, the tired circles under her eyes. And then she turned away. The room was silent. The wind had died down outside. The house held its breath. Evelyn exhaled, eyes fluttering shut. And then, a whisper. Not from the hallway, not from outside, from behind her, from the mirror. Her eyes flew open. She turned over so fast her vision blurred. But her reflection, it was still lying there, facing the ceiling, wide awake. Evelyn's pulse froze. She was breathing heavily, but the reflection was not. Her mouth parted slightly in a silent scream, her chest still, her eyes locked on something unseen above her. And then, it blinked. A slow, deliberate blink. 1 second. 2. 3. Then, it turned to face her. The glass does not lie. Evelyn threw herself backward, her pulse slamming into her ribs. She scrambled out of bed, her breath coming in sharp, jagged gasps. Her reflection had moved on its own. No. She stepped closer. The mirror was normal now. Her reflection mimicked her exactly. Every movement, every breath. Her heart thundered. Was she hallucinating? Was she dreaming? She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the glass. And for the briefest moment, a thin layer of condensation formed where her fingertips hovered, like something was breathing from the other side. She ripped her hand away. It was nothing. It had to be. She grabbed the black cloth from the floor, the same cloth she had found in the attic when she uncovered the mirror. With shaking hands, she threw it over the glass, blocking the reflection. The room felt lighter instantly. The pressure that had been pressing against her chest all night vanished. She exhaled, steadying herself. She was being ridiculous, just her imagination, just a trick of the light. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The whispering had stopped. She closed her eyes, and behind her, the black cloth slid onto the floor. The mirror wants to be seen. Evelyn woke to faint knocking. Her breath hitched. It wasn't coming from the door, not from outside. It was soft, rhythmic, coming from inside the mirror. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the glass. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her throat. Don't look. But she had to. She turned. The cloth was gone. The mirror was bare again. Her reflection lay in bed, exactly as she was. But there was something else, something in the far corner of the glass. A shadow, no features, no details, just a presence, standing behind her. Her throat tightened. She spun around, heart hammering. But there was nothing there. She turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was closer. The faces that don't belong. Evelyn stopped breathing. The shadow in the mirror was closer now, no longer lingering in the far corner, but standing just behind her reflection's shoulder. No features, no form, just a void, swallowing the dim candlelight, stretching toward her like a living wound in the glass. She knew that if she turned around, there would be nothing there. But in the mirror, the thing was waiting. She moved, the reflection moved with her. But the shadow did not. It just stood there, watching. Evelyn's breath came sharp and uneven. She lifted a trembling hand to the mirror, slowly, hesitantly, and for the briefest moment, she swore she felt it. A chill radiating through the glass. A breath that was not her own. And then, the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the world plunged into darkness. And when the glow returned, the shadow in the mirror had a face. The faces of the forgotten. Evelyn jerked away, a cry caught in her throat. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a woman. But her features were wrong, blurred, like wet ink smeared across paper, her eyes nothing but hollow, cavernous pits, her mouth open in a silent scream. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She turned, heart racing, but the room was empty. The figure only existed in the mirror. Then, as she watched, another face surfaced in the glass, then another, and another. They pushed forward, pressing against the other side of the mirror like trapped souls gasping for air. Some were crying, some were whispering, some were grinning. Evelyn staggered back, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her own reflection was still there, but now she was surrounded. And then one of the faces turned and looked directly at her. The mirror shows what it wants. A sudden knock at the door nearly sent Evelyn to the floor. She spun toward the sound, heart slamming into her ribs. A voice, thin, hesitant, muffled through the wood. "Miss Evelyn, are you awake?" It was Mrs. Hill, the elderly housekeeper. Evelyn's breath shuddered as she tore her gaze from the mirror and stumbled to the door. She yanked it open, her hands trembling. Mrs. Hill blinked at her in surprise. The older woman's eyes flicked over her shoulder toward the mirror. "You should cover that," she murmured. Evelyn's stomach twisted. "You," she swallowed, forcing her voice to steady. "You know about the mirror?" Mrs. Hill's lips pressed into a thin line. She hesitated. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out something small and faded with age. A photograph. Evelyn frowned as she took it, the paper thin and fragile beneath her fingertips. It was a picture of a young woman, dressed in clothes that looked at least a century old. Her face was unclear, blurred like something out of focus. The only thing visible, her eyes, dark, hollow, too much like the face in the mirror. Evelyn's breath hitched. "Who is this?" Mrs. Hill's expression didn't change. "She used to live here," she said softly. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the photograph. "And what happened to her?" The housekeeper's gaze flickered to the mirror, then back to Evelyn. "She never left." The house's history. Evelyn barely heard the rest of what Mrs. Hill said. Something about the original owner of the house, a woman named Margaret Asher, who had lived in the manor alone until she vanished without a trace. The details blurred together in Evelyn's mind. Because she knew. She had seen her. Margaret Asher was still here, still in the mirror, still watching. That night she covered the mirror with the thickest cloth she could find. She forced herself to sleep, telling herself that it was over, that she had been imagining things. But as she drifted into unconsciousness, she felt it again, that awful, ice-cold breath, whispering, "Too close. You brought me back." The breaking of reality. Evelyn stayed awake. She refused to sleep. But the house would not let her rest. The whispers had changed now, no longer distant, no longer soft. They had become persistent, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling around her ears in the darkness. And worst of all, they said her name. "Evelyn! Evelyn, wake up! Look at me!" She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. The mirror was covered. She had made sure of it. But somehow, even beneath the thick fabric, she could feel it. The weight of something staring. The air grew dense, suffocating, pressing down on her ribs. She felt cold fingers trailing across her arms, down her spine. But when she turned, nothing. And then the lights flickered. Her breath hitched. "Number no, no, no." Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Fabric moving against the floor, the cloth over the mirror. Evelyn's entire body went rigid. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her pulse pounded, a hammering drumbeat in her skull. Slowly, too slowly, her eyes drifted toward the mirror. The cloth was on the floor, and the mirror was bare. Evelyn's stomach lurched. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't touched it. And yet, the mirror was uncovered. Her hands trembled as she sat up in bed, her breath shuddering, misting the cold air. She didn't want to look. She knew she shouldn't look. But something compelled her. Her eyes drifted to the glass. And there, standing in the reflection, staring at her from across the room, was herself. But it wasn't her. The reflection that didn't belong. Evelyn's lungs tightened. The thing in the mirror was her, down to the very last detail. But it wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back. Evelyn lifted a trembling hand. The reflection did not follow. A cold dread sank into her bones. She shifted slightly. But her reflection did not move. It just smiled. Not her smile. A smile that didn't belong. Slow, deliberate. A twisted, knowing grin. And then, it raised a hand that Evelyn hadn't moved. Her breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, knocking over the nightstand. The lamp crashed to the floor, shattering, and the room plunged into darkness. The whispers become voices. The moment the light died, they spoke, not whispers, not faint, distant sounds, but voices, clear, sharp, surrounding her. She let us in. She broke the seal. Evelyn, don't you see? We're part of you now. She squeezed her eyes shut, hands clamping over her ears. Stop it! The voices laughed, low, hollow, empty. And then, something brushed against her arm, ice-cold skeletal fingers. She choked on a scream, stumbling back toward the door. But the mirror was closer now. The room had changed. The walls had stretched. The floor felt wrong, like she was standing on glass. Her stomach twisted violently as the whispers grew louder, an inhuman chorus of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. She reached for the door handle, but it wasn't there. The door was gone, and in the mirror, her reflection was walking toward her. The house is no longer hers. Evelyn spun around, searching for a way out, but the room was not her room anymore. The walls stretched into an endless corridor, mirrors lining both sides, each one showing something different. Not reflections, not her. Other faces, some screaming, some crying, some with their mouths stretched too wide, grinning impossibly large. And all of them were watching her. Her pulse slammed into her skull. No, this isn't real. Her voice did not echo. The world absorbed the sound. And then, her reflection stepped out of the mirror. The reflection that wanted to live it moved like her. It looked like her. But its eyes were hollow. It was grinning. And as it stepped closer, its voice was not her voice. You don't belong here anymore. Evelyn's body locked up. The mirror shuddered, the whispers chanting her name. She felt her own breath slipping away, as if something was pulling it from her. The reflection raised a hand, pressed it against the glass. A thin crack spiderwebbed across the surface. The other reflections, the trapped ones, began screaming. And then, a hand burst from the mirror, pale, decayed, skeletal fingers curling around her wrist, and a whisper, I want to trade places. The reflection that wants to live. Evelyn couldn't move. The hand around her wrist was wrong, not just cold, but empty, like it had no weight, and yet all the strength in the world. The fingers, thin and bony, dug into her skin, holding her against the glass. She tried to scream, but the mirror swallowed the sound. Her reflection was smiling. And then, it spoke. I've waited so long. The voice was her own, but not quite. It sounded stretched, pulled from somewhere far away, distorted by something inhuman. The hand tightened. The crack in the mirror grew. And then, the fingers pulled. Evelyn felt it, her body tipping forward, her breath vanishing as if the room had lost all its air. She was being dragged into the mirror, into the other side. She fought. She clawed at the edges of the frame, nails digging into the wood as the pressure behind the glass increased. The mirror was hungry. It had been waiting. And now, it was taking her. The struggle for control. Evelyn kicked, screamed, thrashed against the pull. The room around her had changed again, the walls stretching endlessly into a corridor of mirrors, each one showing her a different version of herself. Some were screaming, some were pleading, some were already trapped. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The reflection in front of her, the one pulling her in, grinned wider. It tilted its head, watching her struggle. Then, in a voice too calm, it whispered, "You should let go." Evelyn screamed and yanked back with all her strength. And for the first time, the reflection staggered. It hadn't expected resistance. It thought she was already weak. That was its mistake. With one final burst of desperation, Evelyn threw herself backward, tearing her arm free from its grasp. She collapsed onto the floor, gasping, heart pounding so violently it hurt. The mirror shuddered. The crack across the glass splintered further, spiderwebbing in all directions. And for a brief, terrible second, the reflection's face changed. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else. Something that had been wearing her face. And now it was angry. The mirror fights back. The air grew thick, pressing against Evelyn's chest. The whispers became screams. The room tilted, the floor shifting beneath her as the glass warped and twisted. The mirror was breaking, but not from the outside, from within. Something else was inside. Something that had been waiting behind the reflection, lurking in the endless dark, watching through the glass. And now, it wanted out. Evelyn's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She had to end this. The only way to win her eyes darted to the nightstand. The lamp she had knocked over lay shattered on the floor, its base a heavy chunk of iron. A weapon. She lunged for it. The mirror shuddered violently. The reflection's hands pressed against the glass, fingers twitching, curling as if trying to force their way through. It was now or never. Evelyn gripped the lamp base, lifted it high, and swung. The impact was instantaneous. The mirror exploded outward, shards of glass raining down, reflecting twisted, screaming faces as they shattered on the hardwood floor. The reflections inside the glass wailed, a sound so sharp, so piercing, that it sent Evelyn reeling. She covered her ears, gasping, watching as the last jagged fragment of the mirror trembled. And then, silence. The house stood still. The air was lighter, and when Evelyn finally dared to look down, her reflection was gone. Or was it? Evelyn sat in the wreckage of the mirror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The faces were gone. The whispers had stopped. She had won, hadn't she? Her eyes flickered to the largest remaining shard of glass near her feet. She saw herself, only herself, her own reflection mirroring her exactly. No delays, no smiles that weren't her own. Everything was normal. She let out a shaky breath. Then, the reflection blinked. A second too late. Evelyn's stomach dropped. And then, her reflection grinned. The final descent. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. The reflection was still smiling. Not her smile, not human. It was wrong, twisted at the edges, too wide, like someone who had been pretending for too long and finally stopped caring. Her breath hitched as she leaned closer, hands trembling, every instinct in her body screaming at her to look away. But she couldn't, because the reflection wasn't moving like her anymore. It blinked out of sync. It cocked its head. But Evelyn had not moved. It was watching her now, not just mirroring her. The remaining shards of the mirror shuddered on the floor, vibrating like something was still inside them, something that was still alive. The house was too quiet, the air too thick. And then, the reflection spoke. "I'm not trapped anymore." Evelyn stumbled back, choking on a scream. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs, her vision blurring as the words coiled around her skull. The voice had come from inside the mirror, but her own lips had moved, like something inside her had said it instead. She shook her head, hands clamping over her ears. "Number no, you're not real." The reflection only tilted its head, its smile never faltering. "Not anymore." Then, the glass exploded outward. The reflection's steps through shards flew through the air, the bedroom filling with a deafening screech as the remaining pieces of the mirror ripped themselves apart. Evelyn shielded her face, her body slammed to the ground by an invisible force. The air was wrong, heavy, like something was tearing through reality itself. The whispering had returned, but now it was inside her head. Not many voices, just one. Mine. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She scrambled backward, her hands shaking, her breath shuddering with panic. The largest remaining shard of the mirror lay in front of her. She looked down and saw herself. But it wasn't her, not anymore. The reflection was crawling out. Fingers pressed against the glass, curling onto the floor, dragging itself out of the mirror. The glass stretched like liquid, bending as something stepped through. Evelyn's throat tightened as her own face stared back at her. The reflection had come to life. "You don't belong here anymore." Then it lunged, losing control. The moment the reflection's fingers touched her skin, Evelyn's world shattered. Her body locked up, a paralyzing wave of ice coursed through her veins, spreading from the point of contact. She tried to fight back, to scream, but her voice was gone. The world tilted. The room around her blurred, colors bleeding together like wet paint. Something was pulling her away. No, something was pushing her out. She saw it happen, saw herself standing up, saw her own body moving without her. The reflection had taken her place, and she was being pushed into the glass. "No! No! No! No!" She fought, thrashed, but her limbs felt numb, her body weightless, sinking backward into the mirror's endless black void. The last thing she saw was herself, smiling. And then the glass sealed, and Evelyn was gone, trapped on the other side. Evelyn hit solid ground, gasping for breath, but it wasn't the floor, it was glass, cold, unyielding. She scrambled up, panic rising in her chest, her hands pressing against a smooth, reflective surface. Number no, no, no. She turned, and her stomach twisted violently. The bedroom was still there. But now, she was on the other side of the mirror, looking out. Her own body stood in the room, stretching, flexing fingers that weren't hers anymore. Her reflection had taken her place, and it was laughing, not loudly, not hysterically, but softly, like someone who had just stepped outside after years of confinement. Evelyn pounded on the glass. Her fists made no sound. She screamed, but no noise escaped. The reflection turned toward her, tilting its head. It stepped closer, pressing its palm against the glass. Evelyn froze, her breath choking in her throat. Because as the reflection placed its hand on the mirror, she felt it. Through the glass, felt its warmth, felt its pulse, felt the life that no longer belonged to her. And in her own voice, but not her own voice, the reflection whispered, "I like it here." The cycle continues. Evelyn pounded against the glass. Her fists made no sound. Her screams echoed in silence, swallowed by the void of the mirror's world. She clawed at the surface, desperate, frantic, but the cold, smooth glass did not yield. The bedroom stretched before her, unchanged, warm, real, but she was no longer part of it. She was on the wrong side. Her reflection, the thing that had stolen her life, stood in her place. It smiled, running its hands through her hair, stretching its arms, breathing deeply, like someone trying on a new skin, like someone enjoying the feel of being real. Evelyn sobbed, pressing her forehead to the glass. Give it back. The reflection's eyes flicked toward her. For the first time, it acknowledged her, not as a mirror image, not as something to mimic, but as a separate entity, as something less than human. It tilted its head, and then, in her own voice, it whispered, "Why would I?" Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. The reflection raised a hand, touching the surface of the glass, pressing against her palm from the other side. A wave of cold, paralyzing energy flooded her veins. It felt her. It knew her. And then, in a soft, lilting voice, it said, "It was so easy, Evelyn. You let me in. A prison with no exit." Evelyn sank to her knees, her breaths coming in shallow, rapid gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She closed her eyes, clutching her arms, forcing herself to wake up. But when she opened them again, she was still trapped, still inside the mirror. The reflection, the thing wearing her life, picked up a brush from the dresser and dragged it through her hair. She moved with perfect ease, perfect confidence, as if she had always been Evelyn. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. She threw herself at the glass again, screaming, "This isn't yours!" But the reflection only laughed, a slow, breathy sound, and then it reached toward the mirror's surface, not toward Evelyn, but toward the shards of broken glass still littering the floor. A single sliver, jagged and glinting, rose into the air as if pulled by invisible fingers. Evelyn's breath hitched. No, it wouldn't. The reflection turned toward her, grinning, and then it pressed the glass to its own cheek. Evelyn screamed, pounding against the barrier, shaking her head. "Stop!" But the reflection dragged the glass downward, slowly, deliberately, cutting into her own face. Her face. A thin line of red bloomed across her skin. Not a deep wound, not enough to cause pain, just enough to leave a scar. And as the blood beaded and dripped down its face, the reflection tilted its head and smiled. Now they'll never know. Evelyn's entire body went numb. The house moves on. The next morning, the reflection, Evelyn, walked out of the house. The sun was warm, the air crisp, the world alive. People smiled at her as she passed. The barista at the cafe greeted her by name. Everything was perfect. But inside the mirror, Evelyn watched. Time was meaningless. The house felt distant now, as if it belonged to a world she was no longer part of. Days blurred together. She screamed until her throat was raw. She scratched at the glass until her nails cracked. But no one heard. No one saw. And the worst part, she wasn't alone. The others were in there with her. Hundreds of faces, trapped just as she was, watching as their reflections lived their stolen lives. Some of them cried, some of them pleaded, and some just smiled. A new beginning weeks later, a young couple bought the house. They laughed as they moved in, happy, excited, completely unaware of the house's history. On their first night, the wife wandered into the attic. Her fingers brushed against something cold, hidden beneath a sheet. Curious, she pulled it away. An ornate, full-length mirror stood before her. The glass was spotless. Perfect. And as she gazed into it, she saw herself, her wide, happy eyes, her curious expression. But in the far corner of the mirror, a shape moved. A hand pressed against the glass, and Evelyn, trapped inside, screamed soundlessly. The woman tilted her head, stepping closer. Her reflection smiled. Not her smile, but one that had been waiting. And from inside the glass, a whisper echoed. "I want to trade places." The end.